No ear can hear, no tongue can utter, no heart can understand the refreshings of the Spirit of the Lord, which now I feel.
Before we begin Henry's study of Scripture, I'd like to offer some extra information. Since Thee is listening to this podcast, it's possible that Thee is interested in conservative friends. So, Thee should know that there are a number of other opportunities available on the Zoom platform. If Thee enjoys Henry's presentations, Thee might like to experience them firsthand. If Thee has a specific question about conservative friends, there is a Q&A session held twice a month. There are also several online meetings for worship. These meetings are more spiritually satisfying than one might guess for something held over the Zoom platform. A listing of these opportunities and connection information are available at the very end of this podcast description. With that behind us, let's listen to Henry's discussion.
This is the Greek Bible Study, session 11. We are reading the Gospel according to Mark, and we left off in chapter 7 with verse 23. We were discussing the tradition of the elders there. As I mentioned, I find the verse from Isaiah that's quoted in verse 6 to be very important, where it says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, in teaching human precepts as doctrines." Okay. This is starting with verse 24. From there he set out, that is Jesus, and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Now the region of Tyre is now in what is southern Lebanon, and this was a pagan area. So Jesus is out of what we call Palestine, and this woman was also a pagan, a Gentile. And I understand what Jesus is saying and what she's saying, where he's saying it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. The children's food is food for Israelites, for Jews, whereas the dogs are the non-Jews, the goyim. But she came out with a very clever retort. I think maybe Jesus was amused by it and cured her daughter of this demon. It doesn't say what the demon was. Anyone have further thoughts on this?
Henry, I wonder about this phrase unclean spirit, and is it substantially the same in the Greek as demon? And
No.
my underlying question is, do either of those indicate what today we would call psychosomatic or mental illness?
Okay, unclean spirit's not the same as a demon. Unclean is, I think, a broader word, a more general word. It basically means sort of anything not in alignment with God's will or God's wishes. Whereas a demon is kind of hard to explain in modern English. It's not, we kind of put demons and devils and Satan all in the same pot, but they're actually not. My own impression of what's daimon in Greek, the demon, is maybe a specific kind of problem, maybe a psychosomatic issue or a psychological problem or an addiction or something that's just bugging someone, so that you can have a variety of these demons at the same time. If you recall, Jesus cured a certain woman of, I think, 7 demons. It varies a little bit. When you see it, it doesn't seem to always mean the same thing, and that's why I'm not sure myself. But unclean spirit or anything unclean is profane or whatever, is not in accordance with God's will.
Well, it could also actually literally be an unclean demon, right? I mean, it could.
I'm not sure what you mean by that then.
Well,
Are there clean demons?
Yeah, I mean,
it seems like one's first instinct is to find some physical or mental illness to call this, but it could actually literally be right?
what verse is the word unclean in? Is that 25?
Yes.
25. Yeah, akathatos. That is the word for unclean, non-kosher, if you want to say also.
In Hebrew, it would be treif.
Yes, I think that's the word in Hebrew. So, but it's a broader word than just saying unclean. It has a more technical religious sense for Jews at this time anyway. And I don't know Hebrew, so I don't want to kind of postulate something there I'm not sure of. You know, like unclean animals. There are animals that are clean and those that are unclean, those that are okay to eat and those that are not okay to eat. I've never really understood why some are not clean. That's the way it is. Okay, shall we go on?
Can I just comment just briefly?
Sure.
I'm thinking that in the times that this happened and how women were treated, and this woman was also a Gentile, it was quite courageous of her to insist, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Anyway, this is the Greek word for unclean, akathartos. If you eliminate that first letter A, then you get clean, but akathartos is unclean. While I say that, let me check on one other meaning of that word, akathartos. Defiling. Here's a good definition. Without relationship to God, okay?
One thing, the reason I was asking about whether these could be literal unclean spirits is because so often you talk with people and they say, well, you know, all these miracles that Christ did were just, you know, things that could easily be done by medical science today, and so they're not so impressive. And I'm just thinking that they're really, even if they were physical ailments, there just seems that there is something more than just curing someone. So
clearly there was no medicine that would cure some of these diseases 2,000 years ago. You know, there is such a thing that's still out there today called faith healing, and people go to faith healers, and it is true that people do get healed, some do, through faith healing. Again, putting their complete trust in God that they are going to be healed, just like that story about the woman with the issue of blood who touched Jesus's hem of his, you know, garment and was healed. And he says, you know, he pistis su sesokense, which gets translated 2 ways, and they're both accurate. Your faith has saved you, or your trust, your confidence has healed you. Those words mean all and both of those things at the same time.
And this is an extraordinary healing at a distance, you know.
Yes. It's interesting also to look at the history of healings and through Christians praying for people in the last 2,000 years. Even this kind of thing of healing at a distance, you know, there have been famous saints and who have appeared to perform miracles in the name of Jesus. And you have examples of that right in the New Testament too. If you look at specifically the book of Acts and some of the miracles performed by the apostles there, by, you know, Peter and John and others.
Henry?
Yes.
I'm noticing that the faith here is secondhand. It's not the faith of the little girl, it's of her mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how often we see that. And I don't know that we have to pull it apart, but the faith component is there as it is in practically all, if not all, of the miracle stories.
You recall the
Maybe
story
whether
about the men who were let down a paralyzed man through the roof. They took off the thatch and let him down. I
Right.
mean, their faith really was the strong faith that he would be cured.
And to me, that bespeaks the reality of community, that either our health or our malady can be socially shared, and that to the extent that we care about each other, I think it brings out the healing powers.
It seems strange that Christ would say something so hurtful, because it doesn't seem like Christ anywhere else in the New Testament.
I think the term dog, well, I don't know how inappropriate it would have been at this time, because I do believe Jews would use the word dog to refer to, the pagan Gentiles at times. I think this is not the only place. I mean, today that seems very inappropriate, and just, we wouldn't think of doing that, would we? I don't know how strong that was at that time in terms of name calling. It clearly is not something we would ever do. I hope not.
I think it was deliberately provocative.
Ah, why so, David?
Well, it leads to a dialogue. On the face of it, it's a kind of ethnic superiority and things that a universalist consciousness would say we're beyond that. But I see it as a conversation starter.
Clearly, throughout the Bible, Jews understood themselves as the chosen people. I have understood that in a different way more recently when I heard it expressed, that they were chosen as an example of all peoples, rather than being like the most superior of all peoples, because time and time again, God had to put them in their place when they were straying off and going in all different weird directions and worshiping golden calves and other gods, mammon, and you name it, so that you can't really say they were a good example in so many ways. But even then, I mean, he kept on sending prophet after prophet that kept on ignoring so often what the prophets were saying. And yet we look at those prophets as having said something very powerful.
And we can't see the expression on his face and his tone of voice.
The
So
tone of voice, yeah, unfortunately, we don't get that. The irony in the voice, maybe sometimes sarcasm, maybe sometimes humor. Was it here we read? Yes, here we read about those pigs near the Lake of Gennesaret. They called themselves Legion, which is, a Roman word and refers to a legion of soldiers. Now, for the pigs, for the demons and the pigs to call themselves Legion, there's definitely some humor there. And I could just imagine all the Jews hearing this story just chuckling when they heard that name, because we don't think of Legion specifically as referring to soldiers today. You can have a legion of anything.
but also I believe he had an extra sense of the needs of whoever he met, because he was always in touch with the Lord and his heavenly Father. Nothing he says is on his own, that his Father tells him whatever he's.
Yes, I think that's in John chapter 6, I believe, 5 or 6.
And God knows our hearts like nobody else. So we're thinking as humans when we look at this and evaluate it. We tend to be thinking as of our human nature, but he's deeper than that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think they made an important point that he was always in union with God, obeying and listening to God the Father, and that clearly has to be remembered, I think. Okay, shall we go on? Starting with verse 31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears. And he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Again, Sidon is also today in southern Lebanon, just like Tyre. I should let you know, those of you who don't know, I'm a speech therapist, retired myself. So I'm aware of some of these issues having to do with deafness and speech impediments. And someone who is very hard of hearing from birth or deaf, when they do learn to speak, you probably have heard them that their speech can be very distorted, very hard to understand at times, because there may not be much intonation to the voice. Because when you're deaf and you learn to speak, you're not even hearing yourself speak. You can't even hear your own words because you're deaf. When we are hearing, we hear both from air going into our ears, but also the vibrations going into our body. So it's not just the ear, and it's the body as well. And of course, when you're speaking, the vibrations from the muscles and whatnot of your tongue and mouth and lips, you feel that and you hear that. But someone who is deaf and speaking, who has learned to speak, they don't hear that at all. So they can't judge easily just how loud they are, how soft, whether their voice is rising, falling. So as I was saying, if you're deaf or extremely hard of hearing from birth, your speech is going, if you do speak at all, it's going to be very hard to understand. So this is a very clear case of this person didn't suddenly become deaf. He must have been deaf from birth or from a very young age. I'll just mention too, I can remember seeing a child once, a boy, he became deaf. I think he was about 8 years old when he became deaf. And when I saw him, it was maybe a couple of years later, and his voice, his speech was beginning to become more slurred because he couldn't hear himself anymore. Whereas before he became deaf, his speech was fine. One other thing here, Jesus spat and touched his tongue. That may seem very strange to us, but this isn't the only time Jesus uses saliva to heal, because in the Jewish culture at that time, saliva was felt to have some curative powers. Your spit, the saliva in your mouth, they felt there was something curative about that. And so Jesus is using that because people would understand saliva in that sense, whereas today we see nothing like that in saliva and spit. It's just a completely different idea. In the next verse, then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Now, Ephphatha is an Aramaic word, and it's being translated here into Greek, be opened. So again, the audience that this gospel was written for consisted of some people who did not speak Aramaic and needed to have a translation of an Aramaic word like Ephphatha. So it's given here. So this tells us something about the audience for which this earliest of the 4 canonical gospels was written, included either Greek-speaking Jews or Greek-speaking pagans who had become Christians. Yes, David?
I'm wondering if in either the Aramaic or the Greek, whether one sees the 2 different senses of the word to be open. There's the physical sense of openness. There's also a kind of moral sense that we want to be open to truth. And I wonder, are there any differentiation of flavor there? And
I'm going to,
we know what carries over into Greek, but I don't know the Aramaic or if anybody else does, and what all is implied in Jesus's one-word prayer.
I know this word for open has a prefix on it that I'm not familiar with this particular word. I'm just trying to see if I can find it in the small dictionary here. It means open. It also means explain. And that's all I have here.
Well, it's pretty clear that he is praying that the sense organs be loosened up, that the ears be open to sound, that the speech organs be open to communicating in a way that this person hadn't. But I'm just wondering if there's any underlying sense that we often have of saying that that's how we become aware of God's will for us, is to get our own noise and intentions out of the way and to be open. Just speculating.
I had a question.
Please.
Occasionally in these healings, there will be an Aramaic word that, comes into the gospel, but in many other passages, the Aramaic is not quoted. Mark,
Right.
Is there some particular significance as to why he would have chosen certain places to list the Aramaic word or use the Aramaic word?
The first thought that comes to mind is that someone does remember Jesus using a particular word that gets recorded, whereas in other cases they might have just remembered he did it and said something like whatever. But other than that, and I've never read any scholarly commentary on that either. I mean, Aramaic was the common language of the people at that time. Most people sort of in that eastern part of the Mediterranean spoke Aramaic as their first language. Hebrew was a religious language. Very few people were left in Israel at that time who spoke Hebrew as their first language, their native language. And for Jews outside of Palestine in Roman and Greek Empire, Greek was their first language. And those who knew the Old Testament, they would have known it in Greek first, because the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is called a Septuagint. And it's called a Septuagint. It comes from a Latin word, Septuaginta. Septuaginta is a Latin word, and the word means 70, because according to legend, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament writings, were translated into Greek by supposedly 70 Hebrew Greek scholars, and that's why it's called the Septuagint. In actuality, we don't know, and it appears that various of the books of the Old Testament were translated over a couple of hundred years, a period of over a couple of hundred years, maybe 100 or more years before the birth of Jesus. Some of the translations are good, some are not so good, depending on whatever book you're talking about. So there was a kind of a variety of scholarship involved as to the translation.
Henry?
Yes.
Sometimes when you read in the New Testament a quote from the Old Testament, and then you look at the Old Testament in the King James, they aren't the same.
Right.
And my understanding is that the Old Testament King James version was translated from the Hebrew, whereas the New Testament, when they're quoting a Old Testament scripture in the New Testament, they're using a Septuagint. And so that's why they aren't identical.
When the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament, my understanding was that it's usually the Septuagint version, because that's what
That's what I'm
Paul,
saying.
oh, okay. Paul is writing in Greek to all these Greek-speaking new Christians, whether they were Jews or pagans earlier.
But what the King James translators were working with of the Old Testament was the Hebrew.
I don't remember about the King James version.
Yes, well, that's my understanding of it.
Because, I mean, the Latin translation, the basic Latin translation of the Bible for hundreds of years was the St. Jerome translation. And that would have been the Septuagint translation. Yes, David.
I would need to verify this a little bit more, but the standard preface to a King James Bible talks about the scholarship. And there are other studies. A favorite book of mine is called God's Secretaries, and it describes the structure of the committees that were brought together by King James. And the sense I get from that is they brought the best scholarship that they could get. So people who knew Greek completely as well as they could at the time, and Hebrew and Aramaic. And they had them in 3 different committees, and then they got them together to see what coordinated and what overlapped and what they needed to hash out. But I think that the research was about as thorough as could be done at that time. And if there were ambiguities, they hashed them out in committee and came up with the best guidance that they were given.
You're reminding me of something I learned. It was at the end of the 1st century, I think about the year 95 or so, more or less, that Jewish scholars got together and had some kind of a council, synod, or whatever. Again, this is some 25 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And they came to a position where they said you could only use the Hebrew original, that they did not want Jews to focus anymore on the Greek translation or translations of the Old Testament, whereas Christians were still focusing in on that Greek translation. So you get variations between the Greek translation and the original Hebrew. These were the Pharisees in around the year 95, 96, something like that. In the city, the town of Jamna in Israel, they made that kind of decision. And maybe partly because of the variety of scholarship, good and bad, in the Greek translation. Some of it, again, wasn't as good. So you have that development. And so early Christian writers, of course, they were all Greek speaking. As the early church became much more of a Greek ethnic group rather than what was originally Hebrew, Jewish. So that you had that kind of split there, with Christians still focusing in on this earlier Greek translation rather than on the original Hebrew, because Christians weren't speaking and learning Hebrew anymore, essentially, since they were no longer Jewish. I'm trying to remember, there was an argument between Trypho the Jew, who was a leading Jewish scholar in the Egyptian city of Alexandria, which was the 2nd largest city in the Roman Empire, and a Christian, and I cannot recall the name of the Christian. A dialogue between Justin and Trypho the Jew may have been what I'm thinking of. I'd have to look it up. And I have heard that sometimes they're fussing over the translation, or the Greek versus the Hebrew. And that's a kind of unfortunate problem, because then you're dealing with a translation of the Greek maybe not being correct. I should say sometimes in Hebrew, again, I don't know Hebrew, but I understand that in the Hebrew Bible, there are maybe more words and more expressions that we are not sure how to translate than there are in the Greek New Testament. But of course, the Hebrew goes back hundreds of years more, so they're not always certain of the meanings of some of the words.
Henry, we often see that in a footnote where it'll just say HEB uncertain.
Yes, yeah, that's where you'll see that, right. Okay, anything else here? All right, let's go on. Okay, we're beginning chapter 8. And this is the second of the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves. I think we talked a lot about this last time. Maybe we can add something here or not. I don't know. But okay, let's read this. In those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, he called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples replied, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they distributed them to the crowd. They had also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha.
Wasn't the earlier miracle 5 loaves, or am I incorrect? And
Yes,
this is
5, and then 2 fish. I mean, we have variations in these numbers, and I don't know if you had attended that session, but we were talking about the importance of numbers and how these different numbers could refer to different things, 5 Hebrew nations, Gentile nations, and there's just a variety of things here. In one of these 2 miracles, one is on the west shore of the Lake of Galilee, and the other is on the east shore, the pagan side. Does anyone recall how many husbands the woman of Samaria had?
5 or 7.
She had 5, right. Well, again, 5 pagan nations, and the Samaritans were considered to be half-breeds, only half Jewish to the true Judeans and Galilean Jews, that they had intermingled with pagans in the area while other Jews had been brought into exile in Babylon, so that perhaps the reference to having 5 husbands means, illicit husbands or whatever, being mixed with these 5 pagan nations in the area. It's just a possibility. We have to be aware that the people listening to these Gospels being read to them would have had a much clearer understanding of what was the background of these numbers and these groups. We have to kind of guess sometimes because we're not there. These were written for them specifically. So, okay, let's go on. Verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting on into the boat again, he went across to the other side. I think so often we want physical proof.
I agree.
It's almost as if for people who are very materialistic in their thinking, the only thing that really exists is what your 5 senses tell you, the physical world.
Although it seems like there were a lot of signs, they just weren't seeing them.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that even today. People just won't accept some signs as their hearts are not open to seeing them.
Or even they think that medical knowledge can take care of things.
Not always. Let's see if we can go through one more story here. Verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, it is because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? Again, 12, there are 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles. Oh, I should mention one thing here too. The Greek word here for yeast, zume, also means mold in Greek. It has both meanings. We call it yeast if we're talking about bread, but mold is something bad otherwise. And this yeast of the Pharisees, this should probably be better translated as the mold. The teachings of the Pharisees are more like mold, that they're not good for us. Again, that's a problem with translation. Let me just check on that word, see if there's any of the meanings for that word here. It says here, that which negatively permeates attitude or behavior. There's a Christian writing here in which this word occurs, and it's the yeast of the leaven that has grown old and sour. And that means a life regulated by the Judean cultic instruction. It is contrasted with Jesus Christ, the new yeast.
Yeah, you can have bad yeast. It's still yeast, but it's not good.
Mm-hmm. So old leaven or old yeast and new yeast.
So I guess Jesus was unhappy with them because they couldn't recognize this symbolism in what he was saying, or his ability to provide bread.
I kind of think of them as being very outward, very, I guess the word outward in their outlook. There's something missing in them in terms of perceiving something spiritual in what Jesus was doing. And even asking for a sign, at this point, Jesus had given them another sign. I don't think it would have mattered. They'd find another reason to try to test him, to find some reason to accuse him of sedition to the Romans. Well, I think we're about finished. Any questions or any further comments? No? Okay, great. So we'll finish there today, and I'll see you all next week.
No ear can hear, no tongue can utter, no heart can understand the refreshings of the Spirit of the Lord, which now I feel.
This has been a podcast of Ohio Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. It was hosted by Henry Jason and edited by Chip Thomas. Our music was from Paulette Meyer's CDs, which are Timeless Quaker Wisdom in Plainsong and Wellsprings of Life Quaker Wisdom in Chant. These CDs are available at paulettemeyer.com.